you could probably silence your phones. And if, pardon me? Oh, I don't know how much longer I have. I'm trying, okay? If you need the restroom, there's one right out here, that if you're not familiar with the area. Today we have an event for you, and we're planning some more events. So if you see the questionnaire that you have on your seat, we would really appreciate if you could fill it out for us, because that will help us in the future plan future events. So with that, I'd like to introduce Karen Postel.
Well, thank you very much. Let me tell you a little bit about my background. I am a clinical neuropsychologist, so my job is to diagnose brain disorders like Alzheimer's disease. I teach at Harvard Medical School in their postdoctoral fellowship program, and I also have a clinical private practice in Andover, Mass. And this is one of my favorite topics because I'm going to be sharing with you some really tremendously encouraging information about a disease that I think we're all pretty afraid of. And very kindly agreed to advance the slide, so I'm going to have you advance to the first slide here. The number one risk factor for Alzheimer's disease is age. So that when you get to the group of folks who are age 85 and older, 50% of people have Alzheimer's disease. And that's a tremendously large number. 50% of people 85 and older. You can go to the next slide. And of course, what's happening to our population? The number of people age 85 and older is exploding, so that by 2030, it's going to triple. We can go to the next slide. There's going to be 13.5 million people with Alzheimer's disease in America by 2050. So that's really epidemic proportions. We can go to the next slide. The central dilemma is that with normal aging, you can have some mild but definite changes in brain areas, the temporal lobes and the frontal system, and some accompanied mild changes in memory and complex problem solving that are very, very similar to what happens in early Alzheimer's disease. So it's hard on the surface to tell the two apart. How do we distinguish between normal aging and early Alzheimer's disease? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to tackle this issue, and you can tell the two apart. I'm going to start with what happens to our brains with normal aging, and then we'll talk about what happens with the Alzheimer's disease process, and then what a good workup looks like. All right, so let's start with normal aging. Go to the next slide. The old story, the story that I would have been telling you 10 years ago, is that beginning around age 30, we start to get some mild but definite atrophy in our brain. And it happens to be in the very places, the temporal lobes and the frontal lobes, that have to do with new memory encoding. And that along with those changes that kind of increase over time, there is a decline in our memory abilities. So that when you compare people who are 85 or 90 on memory tests to people who are 20 or 30, the younger people do better. And that's the normal aging story. Luckily, it turns out that story is not true. It's not a true story. So I basically take back all the things I used to tell audiences about normal aging. It's not true. It turns out that when you look carefully at the data of so many of these studies, what you see is a small but persistent subset of successful agers. Every study, they've got this small group of people that are not losing brain volume, and they're not losing their memory skills. they're actually very successful. They're the sharp as a tack people. Right? And it turns out that when you look at, all right, is there a difference between those successful agers and the rest of their same age peers? Are they doing something different? They are. And what they're doing is they have much better lifestyle factors. Usually I get a few groans at this point because it would be so much easier if I said, and they're taking this pill, right? But that's not it. It's lifestyle factors. They are exercising. They are eating heart-healthy diets. And they are engaging in a particular type of thinking late into life. And this is the reason why they are successfully aging. So I'm going to be talking about those factors. You can go to the next slide. As I talk about those, I'm going to introduce two concepts, and it may be familiar to some of you, but it may be new concepts. These were not, oh, yes?
I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you.
Oh,
I'm going to speak up
okay.
a little bit.
I have a microphone on. Is that mic just for the video? Okay. I will try to speak up. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Also, there are some chairs here in the front if I'm not successful. There's tons of chairs here. So, all right. So, the two neuroscience concepts are neurogenesis, meaning new brain cells are being born, and neuroplasticity, meaning actually physically remodeling the brain. And the reason that I say that these are probably not familiar to you is that these are relatively new concepts. When I was in school, we didn't talk about this, we didn't think about this. I learned, as probably most of you did, that you get a certain amount of brain cells, either at birth or very close to birth, and that's it. Right? You don't get any more. You need to protect them because that's all you have. It actually turns out that we have new growth in our brain cells throughout our lifespans, even up to 90 and 100. We are still producing, and I'm going to talk much more specifically about where it's happening and how it's happening. Go to the next one. The other concept is neuroplasticity, which is the idea that our environment, what we eat, how we move, our exercise, our intellectual stimulation, it all has a tremendous impact on our physical brain structures. And as we change our moving and eating and thinking habits, it actually physically changes our brain. We'll go to the next one. All right, so if you have had a baby yourself, or if you have had a grandchild in the past few years, you are really familiar with this concept of neuroplasticity. All right, people get pregnant, and now what do? First thing, they get the microphones, and they're having Mozart playing inside the womb to begin the stimulation. And expectant mothers are very concerned about what they are eating. And babies are breastfed more often because nutrition affects brain growth and development. And babies are given these elaborate stimulating mobiles over their cribs and tons of baby Mozart toys to maximally stimulate their thought process. I mean, these poor kids are like, there's like a lot of stimulation. And we all know what happens in those third world countries' orphanages when the children are raised basically until 4 years old in a tiny crib where they don't have the opportunity to move and explore. That lack of exercise, the lack of movement, it's affecting their brain growth. So in our country, we've drunk the Kool-Aid. Like, we really get that our environment has a tremendous effect on modeling our children's brains. And then, I don't know, when preschool is over, we're like, okay, we're done, we're out. But it turns out that those things continue to model our brains and affect our brains all the way to late life, in our 90s. So that if you took up the violin and practiced, and your finger movements and your strings and your understanding of music, if we measured your brain now with a high visibility scanner and then did it again in 6 months, the motor centers of your brain would be bigger and thicker. When we learn a new skill and when we engage in new thought processes, even when we remember something, it's all physically modeled in our brain. New connections occur. So this is really important. If you think about it, parents in this culture feel very empowered to take steps to make sure that their children, all of our children, are maximally lifestyle healthy, right? They're giving the gift of exercise, good nutrition, good stimulation to our children because they know it's going to affect brain function. I would love if you walked out of here equally empowered to know that the same things are going to be affecting your own brains moving forward. All right, so let's take a deeper dive into these lifestyle factors, and we'll start with exercise. What happens when we exercise? And this is anybody, any of us. We'll switch to the next one. First thing that happens, which is really extraordinary, is that new brain cells pop into life. Exercise triggers neurogenesis. If you go for a swim or you go for a brisk walk or a run, every time it's going to trigger new brain cell growth. Currently, it is the only thing that we know that triggers new brain cell growth. If we can make a date to come back here in 10 years, I will probably have a list of 5 more things that trigger brain cell growth. But right now, the exercise is the only thing that we know that does it. And guess where the new brain cells grow? They grow in the temporal lobe. And in fact, they grow in a little structure called the hippocampus. And that's ground zero for being able to form new memories. Every time we exercise, we are creating new cells in the memory centers of our brain. Oh, can you advance a second? Another thing that happens, again, with everybody, is when you exercise, our brain releases a neurotrophic factor, a chemical, that is involved in cell repair. So every time we exercise on that brisk walk, we are bathing our brain, literally, in a repair chemical. And so cells that are breaking down and getting damaged are getting fixed. The other thing that it's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, it's very much involved in solidifying new memories. So if you're talking to your daughter on the phone today and discussing something, and she calls you tomorrow, and sometimes she might say, I can't believe you didn't remember that I said that to you. If you have exercised and released BDNF in your brain, it is so much more likely that the memories from day 1 will be consolidated and stored, and you will remember them on day 2. The other thing, again, with everybody, all the time, when we exercise, it stimulates a part of the brain. So your eyes are here. Up here, it's the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's in the frontal lobe. And this part of the brain has a lot to do with focus and concentration and organization. And so we can focus more on things we want to remember, and organize them more as they go into our system, and then know where they are to pull them out more easily. And we'll go to the next one. So every time we exercise, we are bathing our brains with cell repair fluids. We are consolidating memories. We are literally putting new brain cells in our memory centers. And so you think to yourself, okay, the basic science tells us this is what happens. What about higher level science? Meaning, if I took a group of people who exercised versus people who don't, what's it look like on actual memory tests? And it turns out that people who exercise do tremendously better on memory tests and attention tests and thinking tests than people who don't. And they've done studies, because you might say, well, it's probably the people who exercise who are smarter. That's why they're exercising. That's why their memories are better. But there have been studies where they've basically taken a room like this and randomly divided people up. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. All the ones, we're going to get you to exercise 5 days a week for a half hour to 40 minutes. Get your heart rate up. The other group, don't exercise. The people who start exercising, their memory test scores increase. And you can actually measure brain changes, thickness of the cell layers of their hippocampus within 4 months. They've done this with kids. They've done it with adults. Here's the biggest take-home piece of information I'm going to give you. When we exercise, our risk for developing Alzheimer's is reduced by 50%.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah. Yeah. When we exercise, we reduce the chances of getting Alzheimer's by 50%. We cut it in half. And this is not a headline study. And by that I mean, you know, one day on the news they say, coffee causes cancer. Right? And the next day they're like, no, never mind, it doesn't cause cancer. You know, the media tends to get all excited about a single study and not read it very well, and then report it, and then they have to go back on it. But this is not that kind of thing. This is multiple studies over multiple years, very well constructed research, and meta-analytic studies, meaning that they have taken all of the studies, put them together, statistically analyzed them to make sure it's not just by chance. And it's very robust research. It's reducing...
Exercise?
What's that?
What's the definition of exercise?
Really, really good point. The most recent studies are showing that any form of exercise is actually reducing our risk for Alzheimer's and has the benefits. So even if you go out for a short walk, you're making progress. The main meat of the research is looking at about a half an hour where you're getting aerobic type exercise, meaning you're getting your heart rate up. So if I say to my patients, you know, if you're going out on a walk, you know, rather than a meander, you power walk. Right? You want to try to sweat so that after your exercise, you have to change your clothes. That's the goal, right? You want to work up a sweat. So most of the research is focused on 4 to 5 times a week, a half an hour of sweaty exercise. Now, a lot of people have some physical limitations. A leg doesn't work. It's hard to move. And you can always make an hour-long appointment with a physical therapist, and they can always figure out a way that you can get your heart rate up. If you are sitting in a wheelchair, they will give you one of those bicycle things, and you can move your arms, and you can get your heart rate up. If you do not have this arm, you can do it with this arm. If you're, you know, there's always a genius way that a physical therapist can help you, of any of us, figure out how do I exercise even with my current physical limitations? And that's really the goal, is to get that heart rate up.
When you talk about heart rate up,
Yeah.
are you looking at a certain threshold of, I think the maximum you're supposed to do is 240 minus your age or something like that?
Yeah, so typically, if you buy a heart rate monitor, and my Apple Watch has one. A lot of our phones have some gadget. The cost of the monitors is really low, and they usually come with like a little instruction packet, and it has a chart for how old you are, you're man or woman, and it'll tell you like where you want to be. It's an area that it's optimal for your heart rate. You don't want to get too high, you want to go too low. And so it's the optimal heart rate. All right, so let's move on. In addition to exercise, it turns out that diet also influences our brain function. Again, go back to the formula. If you have grandchildren and they have formula, it has DHA in it, which is a omega-3 type fatty acid that's very good for brain development. And it turns out that's good for brain function throughout our lives. If you think about what we all know about heart-healthy diets, it turns out those diets are brain healthy as well. Whole grains replacing processed grains. A lot of vegetables and fruits, not so much red meat, more plant-based diets. And you don't have to get crazy, but if you think about 80% versus 20% you can cheat, 80% you're doing your best to have a heart-healthy diet, it's improving brain function significantly. The bad foods, like the high saturated fat, in research studies actually have a significant negative effect on memory. They've done very interesting studies of kids who are eating the Twinkies, the Doritos, the high saturated fat, and comparing them with kids who are taken off high fat diets. And guess what happens to their memory when they're off those diets? It goes up. So there's a reduction in the Alzheimer's risk, not as dramatic as exercise, but there is a reduction when people have heart-healthy diets. And in animal models, if you force the mice to eat Doritos, they are not going to have as much brain plasticity.
Quick question.
Yeah.
What would be an example of a low saturated fat?
It's a great question. Low saturated fat would be the heart-healthy fats like olive oil, the type of fats you would get in almonds or salmon. Flaxseed is another great example. There's also some research, good research, that shows that some foods like berries, like blueberries, are particularly helpful. The antioxidant foods are particularly helpful for memory. The take-home message here is that all of this stuff that we've already learned about to protect our hearts also protects our brains. And probably, if you were listening to a health lecture in the 1930s and 1940s, you would have heard, well, some people have heart attacks and others don't, and there's nothing we can do about it. But now we all know, there's a lot we can do about it. And keeping ourselves physically healthy is really keeping our hearts healthy. That's the exact same place we've come to in the brain research. It is within our control, just like heart attacks. We can prevent heart attacks, we can prevent Alzheimer's disease. We can, not 100% with either disease process. There are some people who do all the right things and still get a heart attack, but we can dramatically reduce our risks. Okay, so cognitive challenge. I get the question all the time. Should mom start doing Sudoku? And my answer is always, if she doesn't like Sudoku, there's nothing about doing Sudoku it's going to help her brain function at all. So Doing crossword puzzles in the abstract does not help your brain function. It does not reduce your risk. What the research shows is that if we are intellectually adventurous, if we are willing to learn new things, experience new things, think about new things, it helps preserve our brain function. And it doesn't have to be fancy things. You don't have to learn another language. You don't have to go take a course on molecular biology. But you might start volunteering at a Head Start program and get some new, really interesting experiences with, toddlers. Or you might start a recycling program, and you might learn a lot about ecological systems. There's some very interesting research that pretty early on in our lives, we get set in what we like. And if you think about, well, has my taste in music changed in the past 20 years? Maybe not. The types of restaurants that I like to go to, the types of places I like to visit, the friends I have, the experiences I have, we can get very set and very narrow. And what the research shows is that to the extent that we are willing to try new things and take new chances and be exposed to new ways of thinking, that is really good for building and preserving brain structures. Think about the example with the violin. If you learn violin, you're actually creating bigger, thicker areas of brain function in your movement centers. So what you want to do is branch out and create new areas of thought for yourself. It's actually very interesting. In mice models, there is a very cool connection between the exercise and the new thinking experiences. So that with mice, if they exercise, they get new brain cells in the memory centers. If they are just exposed to the same old in their mice cages, those new brain cells die away. But if they're exposed to new interesting stimuli, new things to think about in those cages, then those new cells stay and actually migrate and become part of new neural networks. So it's use it or lose it in the sense that we can create more brain cells, but what are we doing with them? Are we just having them watch TV or play the same type of card game we always have? Then we don't need them. So we want new experiences so that we can integrate ourselves within neural networks. All right, so let's talk about, we were talking about those successful agers, that small group of folks who is super healthy and they're doing beautifully, sharp as a tack folks. Let's talk about the rest of people who maybe are not engaging in so many heart-healthy activities, brain-healthy activities, and they're seeing that normal aging change. This is not Alzheimer's I'm talking about. This is when you look at big populations, not just successful agers. What's happening in general with our memories? All right, oh, you can advance it one more time because there's a part two there. Okay, so our hippocampus here, right kind of under our ears, is a structure that allows new memories to get into our brain. And then those new memories are stored all over our brain. So you can think about the hippocampus as a file cabinet drawer. Right? It's a way in. And with Alzheimer's disease, that drawer is broken. There's a huge amount of cell loss in the hippocampus very early on. There's literally no way for new memories to get in eventually. So you have to put memories in. This is the temporal lobe, the hippocampus, and then the frontal lobe, that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, acts like an executive secretary. So the executive secretary, he is focusing on what needs to be remembered. He's going to organize, put stuff in nice files. And then when you need to remember something, he's going to show up. He's going to be on the job. And he's going to look through and know where to find the information. All right, so normal aging, typically, the hippocampus, the file cabinet drawer works fine. You can get new memories in. It's the executive secretary that's like asleep or out to lunch. And you get situations where you're like, I know that's Cary Grant, but who's the other guy? It's, and then someone says, oh, it's, and then you're like, yeah, Jimmy Stewart. Right? It's the aha. Like, I can't recall the name of that movie or the name of that restaurant, and as soon as someone says, isn't it? And then you're like, yeah, I remember. So it's in there. It's a retrieval problem. It's a retrieval problem. All right. So what if all of us wanted to shoot ourselves in the foot and make our memories worse? Luckily, research tells us how to do this. All right, yeah, that's right. So it's, first one is role strain. This is a very common person who will come into my clinical practice. She'll be in her 50s, and she'll say to me, I really am worried about my memory. I can't remember anything. I'm losing it. I think I have Alzheimer's. And I'll ask her about her day. And she'll tell me that she has 3 teenagers, and she works full-time. And by the way, she is being downsized, and so she's in a master's program in the evening. And she doesn't have any household help, so she's cleaning and cooking. And she's got a tremendous amount of role strain. So when this woman walks in to her house through the garage door, she enters her kitchen. She is carrying more than 1 bag of groceries. And her husband calls down, don't forget to put those baked potatoes in the oven because we're going to go to the Smiths tonight for dinner. And then at the same time, her middle teenager has a crisis and is in tears. And she puts the groceries away. She goes on with her evening. And then her husband comes downstairs and says, where's the potatoes? Did you just forget? I told you this. How could you have forgotten that? But did she really forget that he said that? No, she didn't forget. She did not have enough attentional capacity to process what he told her. There was too much going on in her life. So to remember anything, we have to focus on it. We have to get it into our brains, and then we can remember it. And so a very common way, an easy way to make your memory go down is to have a lot on your plate, a lot of demands on your attention, and then you're not going to fully focus and concentrate on the information you need to remember. Okay, sleep tremendously affects our memory capacity. People who have role strain oftentimes will tell me that they go to bed around midnight because they need at least an hour to do something for themselves and read or relax, or they'd just go crazy. And they know they need more sleep, but literally they have no time for sleep. Other people, it's just hard for them to get to sleep. And in our culture, we tend to use exhaustion as a method of putting ourselves to sleep. How many people in here have kids? All right. So you probably had a bedtime routine for your kids. And about an hour before bedtime, they'd get their jammies on, they'd maybe take a bath, there would be a story, the TV would go off. We would, as parents, we give them a soft landing into sleep. So by the time we tuck them in bed, they're ready to sleep. They're not hyperstimulated. A lot of times we don't do that for ourselves. We expect high stimulation. We're watching TV, we're on the internet, we're stimulated by a whole bunch of things. We expect to just get into bed and then fall asleep. And it doesn't happen, and people say, wow, it took me like an hour to fall asleep unless I take an Ambien, which is really bad for your memory, by the way. Or I'm not tired at 10 o'clock at night. I'm only tired at 1 in the morning if I'm defining tired as so exhausted that even after watching TV, stimulating myself, I'll fall asleep. So if we can back up, I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Nope, go forward 1 and 1 more. Okay, so when we get 6 hours or less of sleep a night for a week, there are changes that you can see in functional brain imaging scans within 1 week. The whole brain gets quieter, less activity, but one area in particular gets really quiet, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So when we don't get enough sleep, we can't focus, we can't organize, we can't get the memories organized in a reasonable way to go into our memory systems, and therefore it's very hard to retrieve them. We can go back to you can put us back to so lack of sleep, decreased attention. When we sleep, it's one of the most important factors in being able to consolidate, meaning stick memories for the next day. So if you ever stayed up all night to cram for a test, you might have been able to take the test if you didn't go to sleep, but your ability to remember that information later is not going to be good, right? Because we need sleep, deep REM stages of sleep to consolidate new memories. This is also very interesting. When you have lack of sleep, it's harder to remember positive memories as opposed to negative memories. So if I don't sleep well and I'm thinking about what happened the day before, I'm just going to remember the things that were annoying or not so happy. Right? I'm not going to remember the positive things as easily. All right, we'll go into the next. Obstructive sleep apnea is one of the most common medical conditions that causes what people are really worried is Alzheimer's disease. So if you snore, it sometimes means that you're not getting good oxygen into your lungs. And that snoring sound is reflective of that. As we age, the structures that allow air to flow collapse more easily. And so when we're lying down, they can collapse more easily and not let air through. And also, as we age, we gain weight in our necks. And so if we are overweight, it's very common to get obstructive sleep apnea. So our brains don't let us suffocate. And as our oxygen in our blood goes down, 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 our brains finally say, and shoots out an adrenaline-type substance to wake us up. You might hear that. It sounds like people stop breathing for a second. And then we take a few nice deep breaths, and then we go back to sleep. And our blood oxygen goes down again until we wake ourselves up. All night long, rather than getting that deep restorative REM sleep, we are waking ourselves up. We have low-level oxygen deprivation all night long. We're not getting the restorative REM sleep. And the next day, our memories are worse, and we're more irritable, and also more apt to be depressed. Okay. The other thing that we know is that our mood affects our memories. And when we are depressed or anxious, we tend to focus inward and not necessarily focus on stuff that we need to remember. And so people who are depressed or anxious oftentimes will complain of problems with their memory, even though when you give them memory tests in the office, you say, hey, I want you to focus on this, they do just as well as people who have no mood problems. Who have no mood problems. Yeah. All right, so I'm going to contrast. Oh, yeah.
What is the role of naps?
That's a great question. The question was, what is the role of naps? There is a big, beautiful literature on something called sleep hygiene. It started in the 50s. Everything was hygiene in the 50s. But sleep hygiene is basically, what are techniques that we can use to help ourselves sleep better? And the question of naps depends. So if you're napping, but you're also able to have a solid 7 or 8 hours sleep at night, and a nap feels restorative to you, that's great. But if taking a nap makes it so it's hard to get a full night's sleep, then napping is not going to be good for you. Sometimes people get a full 8 hours or 9 hours or 10 hours, but because they have obstructive sleep apnea, they wake up feeling exhausted, and they take multiple naps through the day. And in those situations, a nap is a clue to you and your doctor that you should get a sleep study. Because if you've slept a long time, many hours during the day, and you're still tired, it could be that you have sleep apnea. You could have other things, but it could be a sign of sleep apnea. All right. Okay, so we'll go on to the next slide. So I want to talk about, that was normal aging. So let me talk about the Alzheimer's. And this is a complicated slide, but what the take-home message from this slide is that you go from normal, totally normal, no problem, lifelong memory abilities, and to what we call mild cognitive impairment, meaning there's been a definite change in your thinking abilities, but it's not bad enough to call it an Alzheimer's disease or dementia, all the way to clear dementia. You are not recognizing your children, right? Really clear signs of dementia. And it's a continuum, and the colorful lines here are the known biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease. In other words, the physical ways that we can tell is Alzheimer's disease present. And as you probably know, there's no one test that tells us well, there is one test. It's called a brain biopsy, where you literally have a hole drilled in your temporal lobe. They take some tissue out and they analyze it to see if it has the Alzheimer's hallmarks. We don't do that unless you're someone who's in your early 40s who has a very rare type of Alzheimer's, and we're trying to figure out what's going on. So for the vast majority of people, nobody gets a brain biopsy. It doesn't help anyways, and so no one would want one. But other than that, there's no way to definitively tell if it's Alzheimer's disease. This red line is beta amyloid. My family threw out all of our aluminum pots and pans a couple of decades ago when they first found that there were deposits of amyloid in the brain with Alzheimer's disease. Probably a lot of people did as well. Turns out that that's not a thing. It's not going to make a difference. But what you can see, which is really interesting, is that normal people who do not have dementia start to get more and more and more beta amyloid deposits in their brain. And in fact, you can have a lot of beta amyloid in your brain and not even have mild cognitive impairment. This one here is tau. You might have heard about the tau protein associated with the CTE, with the football players. Basically, these are tangles of pieces of brain cells. And the tau is a marker of many different types of neurological disease processes, including Alzheimer's. So you see more and more tau accumulating, but you can have a lot of tau and have no dementia whatsoever. Brain structure, meaning are you seeing atrophy? Turns out that most normal people don't have a lot of atrophy. But as you go on, you get more and more atrophy. And typically people with Alzheimer's disease do have significant shrinkage of their brain. And this is clinical function, meaning not a physical marker, but a behavioral marker. How is your memory on testing? How is your behavior? Are you forgetting basic information about yourself? All right, we'll go to the next. I think a helpful way to think about this is normal aging is a green light. Your memory is functioning normally. There's no problem. You're either a very successful ager or you're a normal ager. Yellow light is you've got mild cognitive impairment. You have some thinking problems. Your memory is not as good as it was. But again, it could be because you have obstructive sleep apnea. It could be that if you started exercising, your memory would look a lot better. It could be because you were super depressed, so depressed that you weren't even able to function on the memory tests. There's a lot of reasons people can be in this mild cognitive impairment stage. Many people go on to look better the next time they're tested. Other people, though, go on to develop a full-blown dementia. So it's kind of a yellow light. And then red light is you've got full-blown dementia. Dementia is a generic term like fever. It's always caused by something. It could be caused by Alzheimer's. That's the most common cause of dementia. But it could be caused by multiple strokes. There's a lot of different things in our physical functioning that could cause a dementia. All right. Okay, and we'll skip. All right. So as I said, people, there are some biomarkers and there are also some genetic markers. And there is a genetic test that's available. It's the ApoE, apolipoprotein E, and there's a pretty good association with an increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease if you have a certain version of this gene. But really all this does is it tells you that you have an increased risk and that you might be more likely to get it, but not that you have it. And so there was a lot of excitement about it initially, but most times it's not used in clinical practice.
Can I ask you a quick question? If you could go back to
Yeah.
that. Could you go back to that slide? So when do we really have to start worrying? In other words, when you're in the white group, you're fine, right?
When you're in that, if we can go back one slide, or two slides, yeah. So if you're in this green group, that means you're fine. If you've got some actual measurable memory problems, you are not thinking as well as you were, but those memory problems, those thinking problems are not severe enough to call it dementia, you're in that mild cognitive impairment range. You should worry a little bit. In my practice, I'll say to people, you know what, I want you to come back in 6 months. I'll say to them, I want you to start exercising. And let's get a really good heart-healthy diet, and let's get you a sleep study. Let's maximize your opportunities for improving your brain function. And then let's measure you again in 6 months. And a lot of people look better in 6 months, but some people don't. And so there are people who go on to develop full-blown Alzheimer's disease at that point. Okay, we'll skip. We can skip. We can keep going. We've already talked about that. We can keep going. Talked about that as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about behavioral markers, which is objectively measuring people's thinking abilities. And that's what I do. So if you go to see a neurologist, they might order a brain scan to see if there's atrophy. They might order a test to see if you have the genetic marker. But when you come to a neuropsychologist, you get actual testing to see how does my memory compare to the typical person my age. memory, attention, complex problem solving, the other thinking abilities as well. And so what we do is we give you a set of tests that might last for about 3 hours and systematically measure each thinking ability and then compare you. If you're 60, we compare you to the 60-year-old set. If you're 90, we have norms for people who are 90. And we see, are you normal for your age? Has there been a distinct change, but it's not bad enough to call dementia? Or do you already have a full-blown dementia? Right? And that's really the benefit of that. We call it cognitive testing or neuropsychological testing. Yeah?
Question. This compares you to a broad pool
Yes.
of people.
Yes.
But what about the change over time? Do you compare yourself to yourself 10 years earlier, 20 years
Yeah,
earlier?
it's such a great question. So not everybody's brain is alike. And there are people who start off with really robust brains. They are great thinkers. We call that cognitive reserve. So if you have always had an amazing memory, way better than the typical person, then you might be a couple of years into Alzheimer's disease and your memory now just looks low average. It looks like the yellow zone. It doesn't look like that red zone. So we're trying to compare you to your lifelong level of functioning. There are things that we do in the test. There are certain types of abilities that hold up really well, even pretty far along into Alzheimer's disease. Reading is one of those. Single word reading tends to be very well preserved. And so neuropsychologists will give people single word reading tests. And if you're average on that, you're likely to have pretty average lifelong thinking abilities. If you're superior on that, that's likely to reflect, not always, likely to reflect superior abilities. And that's one of the reasons why the first time someone might get tested, we might take a guess. In other words, we have someone who was an astrophysicist, literally, smartest person in the room always, and now that person's memory is kind of average or low average. And they feel like it's a change. Then what I'll say is, look, now we have the perfect baseline. We have your own neuropsych profile. Come back in 6 months, and we're going to compare you directly to yourself. It's not always 100% clear the first time you get tested whether or not there's been a decline, but once you have that assessment, then we can find very subtle changes and know for sure that it's an actual change.
Okay, second question, follow-up question.
Yeah.
Is it a good idea to have these assessments at some age, or any good age, to use as a basis for going forward as a normal, as you would a normal physical exam?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful analogy. There's a lot of tests that we take. We take a baseline mammography, right? We have baselines for a lot of tests, and then our doctors compare those over time. If anyone has heard of the NFL settlement, the NFL players had a major settlement, and part of that settlement is a baseline assessment program. I actually do baseline testing for many NFL players through that. They don't necessarily feel like they have any problems with their memory, but they're coming in to get a very accurate, detailed baseline, and then they compare themselves to that. So that idea of coming and getting yourself a baseline is a very reasonable idea. Yeah. All right, we can go to the next one. So what is the gold standard workup for Alzheimer's disease? First of all, having a neuropsychological assessment is the gold standard, because with early Alzheimer's disease, most people do not have any atrophy on CT. Most people would not have any problem with a genetic test, and no one's getting tau samples because that involves a lumbar puncture, so that's no fun. No one's doing that. So the gold standard workup is really to get a neuropsych assessment. as well as a neurological examination. Sometimes that can be done through a primary care physician. Most times it's done through a neurologist. And that can include things like a brain scan. And it oftentimes includes blood work to make sure that there's not any other active causes of memory issues. So that's really the gold standard. There's a go to the next slide. Yes. It says anosognosia and anxiety. And this is the reason why you need the actual testing. These two words. Anosognosia means lack of awareness of deficit. Lack of awareness of deficit. You don't know that you have a problem. The part of your brain that keeps track of whether the rest of your brain is working well, that part's not working. So anosognosia, lack of awareness, is very common, one of the most prominent features of Alzheimer's disease. If you have had a relative with Alzheimer's disease, most likely they have said, what memory problem? Very commonly I'll say to someone, so, you know, Mrs. Rao, why are you in my office? And she'll look at me and she'll say, ask my children, right? I'm not here on my own volition. Unfortunately, lack of awareness of deficit increases as the disease progresses. And many times we as family members believe that if it's getting worse, and if only we wait long enough to discuss whether driving is safe or finances, mom or dad will have to acknowledge there's a problem because it's so obvious. But what really happens is that as the disease progresses, his or her ability to know there's a problem in the brain deteriorates more, which makes caregiving really hard. So, typical person who comes into my office who has Alzheimer's disease, if I say to them, how are you going to do on these memory tests? They'll say, great. My memory's fine. So we really need to test them. Anxiety is the other side of the coin. If someone says to me that they're here because their memory's terrible and they're really worried about it, they're exquisitely concerned about their memory, 9 times out of 10, their testing is fine. They're worried, they have a relative with Alzheimer's, they think it might be them. They've got all those factors, including poor sleep and role strain and anxiety and depression, things that dampen their memory. And they're terrified, and they think they have a memory problem. They need to be tested too, to see objectively that their memory is as good as anybody else their age. So for those 2 reasons, we can't just ballpark it. We really need to get a good measurement of people's memory abilities. Okay, so I will just leave you with this question. Just a little thought experiment. If you had a pill that would reduce your risk of Alzheimer's disease by 50%, and the pill was free, and the only side effect of the pill was that you got better sleep, better heart function, and your mood was better, who would take the pill? Does anyone not have their hand up? Wait a minute. Who would take the pill? 50%. So I would love for you to leave empowered. That you don't have to buy the pill from a pharmaceutical company. It's about all of us making decisions, just starting now, to reduce our risk for Alzheimer's disease. So thank you so much for coming. And
Do you have any advice for finding an exercise that's not boring?
oh, that's such a great question. Wow, I love that question. Yeah, so we should love exercise. I run every day, in part because of this. But in the winter time, I'm kind of wimpy, and it's so boring running on a treadmill inside. It's horrible. What I have done, I have an elliptical as well that I've put in front of my TV, and I pretend that it's a Fred Flintstone TV. You ever seen those cartoons, the Fred Flintstone? And stuff only works if someone is moving it on a treadmill. So you can put a treadmill, an exercise experience that's kind of boring, and entertain yourself and motivate yourself to do it by saying, look, I'm not going to do this entertaining thing unless I am exercising. If you walk, you might listen to podcasts, which is a nice way to make walking interesting, or walk with a friend. But it's a great question. It's a great community question to talk about. So, like, what would be fun and interesting for you? Yeah.
I'd like to quote Dr. Karen Postal about being pathologically open to new things as well, as far as different exercises.
Yeah, that's such a great point. So say more about that, because you used a phrase which I think is really interesting. Talk about that.
So being pathologically open to new things hits on 2 points that Dr. Postal discussed, and that is the one is exploring new things to keep the brain going on all things, and she is a fabulous example of this. What is the new instrument that you just undertook?
I took up drumming about 6 months ago, and it's so much fun. It's really, I had to take the piano when I was little, and I was always bored with that. So yes, so I took up drumming, and it was way more fun than I thought it was going to be.
Well, that's kind
good
of
example.
The point of maybe some of the exercises that you're thinking of now are boring. So what about Tai Chi? What about things that tap dancing? What about other things that maybe have not occurred to you yet? Is just my thought.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think it's fun. Yes.
Would you say strength training is equally effective as an exercise for this goal?
Strength training does a lot of very important things, like protect our bones and help balance and et cetera. So strength training is a really good idea. The research so far hasn't shown the same effects for non-aerobic activity. It's getting your heart rate up seems to be the secret sauce in this improvement in brain function. Yes?
If an individual starts out with a deficit in the executive functioning area because of ADHD, for example,
Yeah.
there was an article, popular press saying they're seeing an association between individuals with ADHD and who eventually develop Alzheimer's. And then people thought they had the causation backwards. So I don't know what you think of that, but if there's already a deficit in that area that a young person has worked very hard to create workarounds to support themselves and they're doing well.
Yeah.
But should we anticipate that with age that individual's going to struggle?
It's a really good question. So I'm not aware of any replicated research, meaning sometimes you get a big population study and they find a connection between 2 things like apparently ADD and Alzheimer's. Usually then what you do is you want to replicate it in other studies to make sure it's a real connection, not just a chance connection. So I'm not aware of any replicated research showing that that connection is there. But the other thing to know is that when kids are diagnosed with executive dysfunction or ADHD, they have in front of them from about age 14 to 21 a dramatic growth in their frontal executive systems. In this part of the brain, there's a huge growth spurt. And so just like you could be the shortest kid in middle school and the tallest kid in high school, you can go from having attention deficit disorder to literally growing out of it. The end of the growth spurt is pretty much when college ends, so they're stuck with having to deal with it through their education, but about a third of kids will grow out of it. So the first answer to that is there are many people with executive function as kids who will have normal executive function as adult. And the second part is I don't think that there's been any replication of research like that.
Okay. I've also read that if someone is not dealing with a hearing loss, that they are, for whatever reason, are more inclined to develop dementia. I think it's A, they're not hearing things, B, they're not absorbing it, storing it, being stimulated by it.
Again, I'm not aware of any research that says that the hearing loss and Alzheimer's disease. I will say that it is one of the great mysteries of the world why no one wants to wear their hearing aids. Like, nobody does. And so if you can't hear stuff, you can't get it into that file cabinet system and you can't pull it out later. So I think that's a, yes?
Could you describe what a brisk walk is? I mean, if you say you have a pedometer,
Yeah.
How many steps a minute or how many constitutes a brisk walk?
Well, the best way to figure out for you what brisk is to get a heart rate monitor. And you can buy them for like $5 at Target. I mean, they're super cheap now. And the reason it's important is that your heart rate is going to go up when you exercise. And depending on your level of fitness and your age and all sorts of factors, it goes up very specifically to you. And when it gets into that optimal range, that's where you want to stay. You don't want to go brisker than that. And as you get more fit, that optimal range is going to change. And so that's the beauty of a heart rate monitor, is you can start exercising. You'll know immediately when you hit that brisk enough. And then a year later, you'll also know what's brisk enough. So that I really highly recommend the heart rate monitors. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. The first is confusion about flaxseed. You had mentioned that.
Okay.
Now, everybody seems to recommend that to get you omega-3s.
Yeah.
But I also understand that the balance of 3 to 6 in our body is important, and it's leaning more towards 6, which we sort of don't need as much, I guess. Can you explain that?
Oh my goodness, that is way above my pay grade.
Oh, really?
That you need like a nutritionist for that one. Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's an important question for any food we eat. What's too much? So if you eat, blueberries are good for you, but if you've got a vat of blueberries that you eat every day, you're gonna have trouble with that. So flaxseed is one source of good, healthy omega-3 fatty acids. It's not the only source, and there may be nutritional problems with eating too much of it, which I can't tell you about. But what I can tell you about is that in general, if you're going to, and you should use fats in your diet, you want them to be the healthy type, and that flaxseed is an example, not the high saturated fat.
One more.
Yeah.
REM sleep.
Yes.
It's so confusing to me because I understand when you go through the cycle that the REM is sort of after you've been in bed a long time or asleep a long time, and you go really down into a deep sleep. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so why is it I seem to do my dreaming in when I just doze off for 10 minutes? I don't have time to get there. So
Well,
is there such a thing as dreaming in not REM sleep?
Well, so typically, it's called sleep architecture, and you start at stage 1, which is just kind of groggy. They would call it the hypnagogic state. And then you go into a deeper 2, down to 3, down to 4, which is the really deep REM sleep. There are some conditions, some sleep disorders, where people rapidly go into REM, and it can cause some mischief because it can make it hard for you to tell what's dreaming and what's reality. And you can get, it's called a multiple sleep latency test. You can see there's a whole field of sleep medicine. And so they can tell you if you have abnormal REM. Sometimes though, it's not always clear to us how long we've been asleep. And so, yeah, 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 yeah. So it could be that your experience is totally normal and not associated with any sleep disorder. But there are some sleep disorders where you just go into REM really, really quickly, and that can cause some mischief. Yes?
You were talking about snoring, and then when does snoring affect, when does that become an issue and affect your memory? Is there a certain amount that's okay?
Yeah, that's a great question. You ask the person beside you, there's like no amount that's okay. Like, get rid of the snoring. You can snore without having obstructive sleep apnea. Snoring is a common sign of obstructive sleep apnea. The problem is when you are not getting good oxygen at night and your sleep architecture is disrupted. And a typical sign during the day is that you're very tired and you fall asleep very easily. So if you sit in a chair to watch TV and you doze off, or if you are a passenger in a car and you doze off easily, or God forbid, if you are the driver of a car and you have to roll down the window and blast the air conditioning. They've actually done studies of people with untreated sleep apnea and people who are over the legal limit of alcohol. And guess who have better reflexes? The drunk people do. The drunk people do. So it's really if someone is very fatigued during the day, also headaches are really common, then it's a good idea to go see your doctor and say, hey, can I have a sleep study? They actually have home sleep studies now. They're very super easy to get and not a hassle. So, yes?
To return to the baseline test, how do you correct in a baseline test if the person had a bad night's sleep before or didn't eat properly or has the beginnings of a cold or something like that that would impair cognitive function anyway?
Yeah.
So how do you get a baseline
Yeah.
when people vary day to day?
Well, it's a great question. So I always ask people, and most neuropsychologists do, hey, did you get a good night's sleep last night? And if they said to me, oh, I just got 3 hours, and that's all I got, I'll say, you know what, let's defer the testing. If they say, I only ever get 3 hours, then I'll say, well, let's not waste our time with the testing. Let's fix your sleep and then come back for the testing. There are things that we know that impair memory function. Using Ambien on a regular basis really affects your short-term memory abilities. Using benzodiazepines like Ativan, lorazepam, those type of things can affect your short-term memory. Using marijuana. A lot of people use marijuana. And even if you're not high, it stays in your system for about 3 weeks and significantly affects your memory and your problem-solving abilities. And so if someone has used in the last 3 weeks, I will say to them, let's be sober for 3 weeks and then come back and then we'll test your memory again. So to the extent possible, we like to clear out all the clutter and get as good a baseline as we can. And sometimes that's not 100% possible, but we try to do that. That's a super great question. Yes?
Well, you just mentioned marijuana. What about CBD?
CBD, I think, I am not 100% sure, has less of the THC content in it.
Oh, yes, that's
And
done.
so it would not affect the thinking. I'm not 100, I know there are specific studies on that issue, and I have not looked at them recently, so I don't want to tell you an answer if I don't 100% know it. But for sure, if you're ingesting THC, it will affect your memory. When you stop 3 weeks later, it's not going to affect your memory anymore, but while you're using it, it will affect it. But that's a good question.
And what about melatonin?
Nothing's free. Melatonin can affect your thinking. If anybody's used melatonin, sometimes you feel a little bit like groggy the next morning, and it can affect your thinking. It's not as bad as Ambien. One of the best ways to improve our brain's ability to fall asleep is exercise. On a day that you exercise, it's just easier to fall asleep. So if you introduce exercise and you put yourself on a nice nighttime routine, you give yourself about an hour to fall into sleep. There's some wonderful apps you can use on your phone that are progressive relaxation. Then you're going to really maximize your ability to be able to sleep without external supplements. And there's always drawbacks to using those.
Your testing for the baseline testing, is it puzzles and games and
That's a good
questions
question.
and lists and things?
Yeah. It's very interactive. It's the opposite of, remember when you took achievement tests in school and you got a whole bunch of questions and you had to fill in the bubbles? It's totally different from that. We march through every brain system. And so, for example, if I'm measuring your language abilities, I might show you pictures and have you come up with the names of things. Or I might ask you to name all the animals you can in a minute. If I'm testing your memory, I would show you pictures or designs and have you remember those a half hour later. Or to test your verbal memory, I might read you stories or give you pairs of words to remember. Problem solving could be words like, how is this and this alike? Abstract analogies, or we use puzzles and blocks and you have to solve those puzzles. So it depends on the brain system we're measuring. And we have different relatively short tasks for you to do. Most people find it kind of interesting and fun.
You mentioned single word reading?
Yes.
Single word? What is it?
Well, it's reading words, just single words. So there's a lot that can go wrong with reading comprehension. So if I had you read a paragraph, if you had attention problems, that might affect it. There's all sorts of things that can affect a whole passage. But if I give you a single word to read, and the reading tests, they're almost all not phonetically correct. They're words that you would just have had to know throughout your lifetime. You can't sound them out in the moment. And that's a really good measure of your lifelong reading ability. And that's a pretty good measure of your lifelong thinking ability. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty, what we call hold indice. It's pretty good, yeah.
According to your chart, it seemed to be gradual from just normal to full-blown. And I've seen so many instances of full-blown without any signs prior to that.
Oh boy. Well, so it's a good question. I don't know if everybody heard, but it's you know, most Alzheimer's cases are very gradual onset, and sometimes people have had it full blown. The clinical course, how it develops over time, is a very important clue to us as clinicians about what type of dementia it might be. So if someone came into the office and they had, all of a sudden, they had a big change in their thinking abilities, the first thing you might think of is a stroke or some other systemic problem, like liver disease that's really severe. Alzheimer's disease almost always develops slowly, and sometimes, bless you, sometimes it's not apparent. So a classic example is maybe mom fell and broke her hip, and it was only once she came home and her children were living with her to help her out that they realized, like, ooh, things are not going well, right? She's not really able to cook for herself. We didn't realize that. Sometimes certain people are just very, you know, relaxed about memory problems. You know, and they don't really consider it a problem until it's super, you know, really bad. And they just consider that normal aging. And so most of the time, when you get the full picture, it is a gradual onset if it's Alzheimer's disease. All right. Oh, okay. Yes.
Do you find that doctors, general practitioners, are kind of blasé about it because naturally that's the first place you're going to go?
Can't hear you.
And do you think they don't
I'll repeat it.
address it the way that they should?
The question was, do I think that primary care physicians, family doctors are blasé about it and may not address it the way? I think it's really specific to the doctor. So in my clinical practice, I have a lot of physicians who are really concerned about their patients' thinking abilities and will send people along if they're worried about them. So I think it really just depends. I think there's a lot of folks out there who are very much on the ball and concerned about it.
You spoke about strokes. If someone has a period of 3 or 4 strokes, how much are they going to get left in their brain?
Say it one more time, a little louder.
Someone who has had a stroke.
Yeah.
And as years go by, they're getting older too.
Yeah.
So how much is this all going to connect, you know, as far as my loss?
Well, you are right up, that question is right up there with the most sophisticated researchers in Alzheimer's that's cutting edge, which is the idea that Alzheimer's is an interaction between our heart and brain function, cerebrovascular health, and the aging process, and maybe a couple of other things. So that the more hits we have with multiple strokes, the more likely that that aging process might result in something like Alzheimer's disease. So it's a very a sophisticated idea, and it's right on about which is which is why we really all need to protect ourselves to the extent we can from getting strokes. And how do we do that? We exercise, we eat heart healthy, right? Those are the things we do to prevent strokes.
Sometimes you do those things and you still end up having
Absolutely. All of us know people who, are excellent, take care of themselves completely, and they still get a stroke. And the other thing is that it depends on where the strokes are. So you can have a small stroke that is placed just in the exact wrong spot. And because it's interrupting a very significant part of brain function, it can cause huge changes. Whereas another person can have a larger stroke in an area that's not going to affect their brain function. So it's not just, did you have a stroke, but where did you have the strokes? That said, I want to make it really clear that you can have strokes and never get Alzheimer's disease. It's not that if you've had a couple of strokes, you are sure to get Alzheimer's disease, but your risk might be increased. All right. Okay, yeah?
What if you have stress in your life and you, as an elderly person, you become a primary caregiver for your partner? Does that impact both Alzheimer's and regular cognitive impairment? Or is one, is it greater in one than the other?
That's a beautiful question. The question was, what if you have stress in your life? So many people who are aging, they become the primary caregiver for their spouse or maybe multiple people in their families, and it's very stressful. If you are a caregiver for someone with Alzheimer's disease, 50% of the time you get a clinically significant depression. It's so hard. It's really hard. And so what does that do to the caregiver's physical, mental functioning? There's a whole field, psychoneuroimmunology, which is just a fancy way of saying that when we're very stressed, it harms our immune system's ability to repair our body. And that theoretically would affect our brain function as well. So, it's I always say, it's not like you can sell your kids to science, right? If you've got a lot of stressful experiences, there's some you can't get rid of. You can't take everything off your plate. But you want to reduce your stress as much as possible. And also, if you have a lot on your plate, just be very forgiving of yourself, not to expect perfect brain function. Okay, I think I'll end there. And again, thank you for coming.